The history of slavery remains one of the most complex and painful chapters in human civilization, where exploitation spanned not only labor, but also the intimate aspects of life. Sexual exploitation and forced procreation among enslaved populations reveal an underexplored aspect of this brutal institution, where the bodies of enslaved individuals were often manipulated to satisfy white desires for control and power. In particular, cases where enslaved men were forced into sexual encounters by white women or coerced into procreating reflect a distinct form of violence, one often overlooked in broader studies of slavery. These encounters were not merely about physical control, but represented a calculated and systematic method of psychological domination, where white supremacy permeated even the most personal areas of enslaved lives. This article explores these dimensions in depth, illustrating how exploitation, driven by the fantasies of dominance and the economic desires of slaveholders, forced men into a harrowing existence that affected every aspect of their personhood. In analyzing sexual exploitation and forced procreation during slavery, it is critical to understand the layers of power dynamics that played out on plantations. White women, often viewed as passive figures in the social structure of the time, sometimes participated actively in these exploitative relationships. They wielded authority within the boundaries of slavery, manipulating the system to engage in sexual relationships with enslaved men. For many white women, these encounters were more than sexual gratification. They served as a way to assert power and control over a vulnerable population. They could compel these men into intimacy or procreation through the constant threat of punishment, including the threat of separating them from their families, selling them, or inflicting severe physical abuse. This environment, rife with fear and subjugation, stripped enslaved men of any autonomy, reducing them to mere instruments in the designs of their oppressors. The psychological impact of such relationships was profound. Enslaved men, already stripped of their humanity and agency in every other aspect of life, found even their sexuality and reproductive capabilities turn into tools for exploitation. The very notion of fatherhood, a role typically associated with dignity and legacy, was corrupted. Forced to produce children who would, in turn, become part of the labor force, they were rendered incapable of building any familial bonds or imparting values to their offspring. Their children were property rather than family, each child a constant reminder of their helplessness and the inhumanity of the institution that bound them. Many enslaved men endured the humiliation of knowing their offspring would grow up under the same brutal conditions, further perpetuating the cycles of abuse and exploitation that characterized their own lives. White women's involvement in these exploitative relationships highlights the complexity of gender dynamics in the system of slavery. While white women were themselves bound by a patriarchal society that often limited their freedom, they simultaneously exercised authority over enslaved men. Some scholars have argued that for these women, engaging in relationships with enslaved men was an assertion of power within a framework that otherwise rendered them subordinate. The ability to command and manipulate another person's body, to force intimacy upon them, or to demand children for labor represented a twisted form of agency. Within the confines of their marriages and the broader social structure, white women could rarely wield such power over white men. But in the realm of slavery, they could direct their suppressed frustrations and reclaim power by dominating those who had even fewer rights than they did. This use of enslaved men as outlets for asserting control and independence created a paradox, as these women navigated between their roles as subordinate wives and oppressive mistresses. The plantation system's economic motivations also fueled this exploitation. The demand for labor was unceasing, with children born into slavery becoming a part of the system from birth. Forced procreation became an unofficial policy on many plantations, as it allowed slave owners to increase their labor force without the costs associated with purchasing new enslaved individuals. The children born from forced relationships were systematically commodified, often registered as assets in estate accounts and appraised for their future labor potential. Each birth represented economic growth, and thus enslaved men were coerced into fatherhood, sometimes with multiple partners, based on the master's directives. This pattern of forced breeding reduced human relationships to financial transactions, where intimacy was dictated by economic strategy rather than personal agency or affection. For many enslaved men, sexual exploitation carried a deep sense of shame, reinforced by a culture that rendered them powerless. Any resistance to such advances could result in dire consequences, not only for themselves but for their loved ones. This constant threat deprived them of control over their own lives and the opportunity to form meaningful relationships. Their bodies were at the mercy of a system designed to extract value through any means necessary, reducing the sacred aspects of love, companionship, and fatherhood to mere extensions of a cruel economic agenda. The dehumanizing aspect of forced procreation reflected the broader racial ideology that viewed black bodies as tools to be managed and controlled for the benefit of the white ruling class. Enslaved men, much like enslaved women, found themselves trapped in a cycle of violence that permeated the most intimate areas of their lives. Moreover, the broader societal implications of these forced relationships further underscore the racial and social divisions of the time. The children born from forced procreation inhabited a complicated and often dangerous space within the plantation hierarchy. They represented the mixed heritage of black and white, a reality that white society frequently stigmatized and marginalized. Many of these children were absorbed into the enslaved population without acknowledgement of their white parentage, despite often being visibly biracial. Yet their existence highlighted the hypocrisy and contradictions within the slave-holding society, where notions of purity and racial superiority were simultaneously upheld and undermined by the relationship slave owners and their families force upon enslaved people. These children, symbolizing the pervasive reach of exploitation, served as living reminders of the moral corruption embedded within slavery. The psychological toll on enslaved men was not only confined to their personal suffering, it often extended to entire families and communities. The forced separation from their children, the inability to protect or influence their lives, and the knowledge that they were powerless in the face of white control created lasting trauma. Communities within the enslaved population developed resilient systems of support and solidarity, yet these relationships were constantly undermined by the reality of forced procreation. Enslaved men were frequently forced into multiple unions, disrupting any sense of traditional family structure or loyalty, while simultaneously exposing them to increased physical and emotional exhaustion. This constant upheaval stripped them of the stability necessary for cultivating a coherent sense of self or community. In understanding the full impact of sexual exploitation and forced procreation, it is essential to acknowledge the lingering effects of this trauma. The intergenerational impact of slavery's sexual violence has persisted in various forms, influencing perceptions of identity, masculinity, and agency within African American communities. The historical memory of such exploitation, where intimate parts of one's being were violated for economic gain and white dominance, continues to shape collective narratives. The silence around these abuses, maintained both during and after slavery, has left a profound mark on the descendants of those who endured it. Many families still trace their lineage back to these coerced relationships, and the generational pain is exacerbated by the knowledge that their ancestors were denied the right to love freely, to choose freely, and to live without fear of sexual and reproductive exploitation. As we consider the legacy of sexual exploitation and forced procreation, it is crucial to reflect on the deep resilience of those who survived this brutality. Enslaved men who endured such exploitation exhibited extraordinary strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. Despite the calculated efforts to strip them of dignity, identity, and autonomy, many found ways to reclaim their humanity, forming meaningful bonds and nurturing their communities. The legacy of their survival and endurance stands a testament to their unbreakable spirit, serving as a powerful reminder of resistance amid oppression. This exploration of sexual exploitation and forced procreation reveals a disturbing yet essential facet of slavery's history. It confronts the uncomfortable truths about the ways in which power was exercised not only through physical labor, but through intimate, personal violations that reached into the core of human identity. Enslaved men, like their female counterparts, were subject to a level of control that penetrated every layer of existence, including their relationships and family lives. These acts of exploitation, driven by a desire for dominance, profit, and perverse gratification, underscore the extensive reach of the institution of slavery, leaving a legacy that calls for acknowledgement, reflection, and remembrance. The stories of those forced into these encounters deserve to be told, not only as a record of historical injustice, but as an enduring reminder of resilience and the unyielding struggle for dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression.